Well, today we pass on to page 9 of these books, and to say something about the personality of Bernard. And I think the temptation for most of us is to believe that Bernard wasn't a wimp, to believe that he was, a reasonably ordinary sort of guy, is the first kind of challenge, because so many of the stories and assumptions we have about him make us think that if he were a member of our community, we'd hope that he lived on the other side of the monastery. And we wouldn't want to have him around us. So let's just see if we can see something about his personality. So several likenesses of Bernard as abbot of Clairvaux have come down to us, including one which grandly proclaims itself the Vera Effigies. That makes him nice and skinny, but it's a 15th century kind of work, and it's probably unlikely. There's another one in Fontaine-les-Dijon, where he was born, which makes him into a Burgundian, a round-faced guy, but that's not true either. It seems likely, however, that these posthumous reconstructions are of little value in forming a picture of what Bernard looked like. More reliable is a word picture from the pen of Geoffroy of Auxerre, Bernard's secretary and travelling companion for over a decade. Bernard is represented to us as being of average height, although he may have seemed taller to some observers because he was so thin. He appears to have inherited the Germanic features of his father: fair skin, blue eyes, blonde hair, and a reddish beard. So already we know a little bit about him. We know that he was a blonde, we know that he was a Bernhardus. There's a strong German affinity there, and when there was question of his studying, it probably would have been in Germany. Preaching the crusade, he circulated in Germany without very much problems, the Holy Roman Empire, so forth. An examination of his relics, if you please, reveals that he had a long head and a high forehead. According to William of St. Thierry, his mien was pleasant and his whole bearing attractive and even elegant. So that's about as much as we can know about the physical side of things. But if you ever wanted to reconstruct him, that's where you'd start. Such a good-looking young man was, if we are to believe his biographers, eagerly pursued by women. And so we have them after him at every possibility. There are several stereotype stories which convey this suggestion. It may be, however, that the emphasis on Bernard's sex appeal is nothing more than a conventional compliment offered by admiring narrators to highlight the heroism of his monastic choice. In other words, to say that he had a lot of sex appeal is simply to say it's another compliment. It doesn't necessarily have to be true. Certainly he had charm, which was not quite the same as sex appeal. People used to like him as a personality. And he did get on with a number of well-placed ladies later on in his life. But Leclerc has a number of studies on his dealings with the feminine, and they're well worth reading if you're interested in this side of his personality, but I don't think the last word has been said. Of his charm experienced throughout his life by both men and women and his leadership qualities, there can be, however, little doubt. Bernard was a leader by nature, and he was happiest when he was at the head of a crowd with lots of people following him. That's when he was happy. And you can imagine how he'd go as a hermit. It would be impossible. He would lack an audience. He would lack somebody to follow him. So he's one of these people that led well, a natural leader, and this, naturally, made him happy. But the sex thing is a little bit more difficult. And I imagine people will start trying to work out some answers in the next few years. In point of fact, Bernard seems to have never been a very physical person. He took no part in the jousting so favoured by his contemporaries. He was indifferent to his personal comfort. I don't say this by way of, oh, what a wonderful man he was, what a holy man he was, but just saying he wouldn't know if he was sitting on a rock or sitting on a soft chair. And again, ask yourself, have you known people like this? That wouldn't know if they're putting salt or sugar on their food, and because they can't say it doesn't make much difference. It's not virtue, it's just that they you know, what's the difference? You know, you try a practical joke on them and it fails always because they don't notice. And there are people like that. We had a monk who's since left and is kind of a hermit among the Aboriginals in Australia, but he'd grown up, his father was an Irish ambassador and so forth, grown up in very high-class society. But he is absolutely unaware of anything like personal comfort. You know, he would sit on a chair that had one leg 3 inches shorter than the other, not really notice. He'd just say, well, you lean on one cheek and it's all right. But there are people like that. And this is the sort of person Bernard seems to have been. And we'll see. And he was never much interested in food and drink, whether it was a cause or effect of his stomach troubles. But he's never very interested in food and drink, didn't know what he was eating. In fact, he was inclined to go to extremes to avoid any semblance of pandering to the flesh, although one may suspect that such detachment was easier for him than for many. It wasn't, it was a purely natural thing. He was more interested in other things, not interested in his grub, not interested in food or anything like that. He never seems to have quite appreciated why others found physical pleasure so attractive. Now, he couldn't work out, you know, why. You know, for him, it's a real deviation. There's something sick about this man. Look, he's enjoying his food, or he loves to be comfortable, and he goes through the monastery looking for extra cushions put under his backside. So, you know, there's something odd about that. You know, he's real sick, that guy. According to Bernard, his priorities were so weighted down towards more interior delights and interests that he looked on physical indulgence almost as some sort of deviation. And the same with curiosity about external things. So when he talks about people being inquisitive and nosing into other things, you know, why do people do this? But we know that there are people, most of them in monasteries, that just can't see somebody wearing black socks under their habit, and they say, aha, he's going out. He's the one that's booked the car. I wonder where he's going, you know, and all this kind of thing. We had a guy that was an expert at it, and he always used to like to get people who were particularly secretive. And I remember he came up to one guy, this was 20 years ago, and saying, I hear you're going out today, which of course... And the guy was totally annoyed, and he said, why is that? And he said, you shaved at a different time. But, I mean, you do get people with a natural, it's their kind of interested, extroverted and sensate people that are interested in details about people. Bernard wasn't like that, and for him, that was some sort of sickness. And that's why he comes out, as we'll see in some of the texts, very strongly about gossips and people that are nosy and inquisitive, and people that practice curiosity and fussy about their food and fussy about their health and so forth. He's very severe on them because he doesn't experience it himself. And he says, what are these people doing? Some explanation of his attitude may be found in the amount of sickness he experienced. Even as a youth, he seems to have been delicate. In later years, he was often beset by prolonged illnesses, whether constitutional, psychosomatic, or at least in cause self-inflicted, it is hard to tell. These have been diagnosed by Dr. Jean Leclerc as chronic gastritis developing into a pyloric ulcer accompanied by neuralgia, stomach spasms and cramps, intestinal difficulties and asthenia. And the whole lot goes very well if you read Jung's description of an introvert, the sort of things that introverts suffer from. You've got a nice list of them there. But he may have had some physical basis at the beginning, but it seems to be a whole collection of things which may partly be constitutional, partly psychosomatic, and partly self-inflicted. But the odd thing is that he lived a comparatively long life. if you're only good at mathematics, you'd know he lived 63 years, which is long enough in the Middle Ages, and especially someone who enjoyed bad health, it's quite a long time. And so, you know, it's interesting. That Bernard was able to live such an energetic life despite such debilitation indicates something of the strength of his inner drive. Eugene Boylan, the abbot of Roscrea, who wrote a few books, some of the older men may have come across them, who was killed by a pectoral cross. He's a terrible driver, and he had a crash, and the pectoral cross pierced the pericardium, the thing around the heart. And the hospital thought he only had broken ribs. They strapped him up for that, and of course took off the strapping, and he just died. So he died of a wound inflicted by a pectoral cross. So beware, any of you that are ambitious. But he was a little bit like that. He lived off his nerve. He liked a good meal and so forth. But fundamentally, he was a man that was always on the go, always perpetual motion, and really had such inner drive to do things. I mean, before he entered the monastery, he was a gold medal swimmer for Ireland. He was one of an elite music circle, and also he was a member of the Vienna, one of the early atomic physicists in the 30s in Vienna, and had won all sorts of physics awards and so forth. So he was a high achiever, but he just didn't need very much. He'd push a button and off he'd go. Lived off his nerves, didn't need much in the line of food, and that's the kind of thing. I think to try and understand somebody like Bernard, we have to keep coming back to what sort of guy he was. And do we know somebody like that? And not trying necessarily to put everything in the box of virtue or piety or to be... but this is just the sort of way he was. Couldn't think much about food or that. From all accounts, he appears as an intense, passionate and decisive man of quick intellect and retentive memory, who pushed himself hard and lived off his nerves. He seems to have compensated for his lack of physical prowess by more interior aptitudes and attainments. Maybe like Merton, he was very clumsy. I mean, when they heard that Merton had been electrocuted, nobody was surprised. So they told me 2 weeks ago at Gethsemane, a couple of people said, you know, he's always falling over things and bumping into things. He was forbidden to drive. He only did it twice and wrecked 2 cars. And, you know, so it does happen. Maybe Bernard was a little bit like that and compensated by a great deal of intellectual activity. His writings, he manifests a high aesthetic sensitivity as well as literary craftsmanship. He not only wrote those things or dictated them, he corrected them very carefully. And usually not to change the meaning, but to make it a little bit more sharp, or occasionally to sharpen some of the barbs, or to make it a little bit more clever. So he really was a craftsman with words. And that's something, he worked to produce something. It just didn't all flow out. You see the pictures of him sort of lolling in the garden with a scroll in his hand and Our Lady in the tree and the words rolling out of his mouth. Well, it wasn't quite like that. He worked very hard on the things that he wrote, especially those that were intended for publication. Some of them he recalled and rewrote. The Apologia, for example, has 2 distinct versions. He was an artist with words. His elegant prose often approaches the level of the poetic in its power to touch and move the sensibility of the reader. And sometimes in some of the texts that we'll be giving out, some of these can be almost written as poetry without any alteration, and just simply the way that he blends some images and so forth. His elegant prose often approaches the level of the poetic in its power to touch and move the sensibility of the reader, not so much to impart information or theology or spiritual teaching, but it touches the person. It's an interpersonal communication. He had that gift of touching people so that when he spoke they felt something. They didn't just go back to sleep. They may have felt angry, they may have felt threatened, they may have felt challenged, they may have felt happy or consoled, but they felt something. And that's to say, his words got through. He wasn't just simply, and the 44th point and so forth, but rather he touched them. And in his apparently effortless command of the nuances and rhythm and assonance, well, most of his flow comes from the fact that he introduced the vernacular. Some of the syntax of medieval French, he introduced this into the Latin, and so gave it a new format, in a sense, a new liveliness, which instead of just using typical forms, allowed it to have more grace, more lubrication, we might say, more ability to flow gently on the ear. Although in the Apologia he gives vent to a reformist diatribe against the preciosity of some contemporary artistic enterprises, and we'll be looking at some of those, yet his role in the building of Fontenay and his contribution to the reform of Cistercian chant indicates that he was a man of fine aesthetic tastes. What disturbed him was not art per se, but unprincipled extravagance. Or, as I've improved that phrase since, unprincipled ameliorism. People are always wanting to live a little bit better. Last year we had black and white television, this year we have colour television. Next year we have cable television. Next year we have a possibility to pick up satellites. Next year we have something else. That's a kind of secular principle, ameliorism, that every year you live a little bit better. And it's possible for it to come into monastic life. And when it does, okay. But if it's unprincipled ameliorism, that's what he didn't like. Monks making themselves comfortable, covering the walls with grotesques and living in high buildings, as he says, covering the church with gold and the poor of the church go naked. That kind of thing. So we'll come back to that. But this is what he said. The monk should know better than this sort of thing. He didn't object to art. He didn't object to finesse. But rather what he did object to was extravagance. Okay, that said he's a nice guy. Now we'll say, but there is no doubt that Bernard's was a commanding personality. The darker side of his character was his tendency to ambition and to domination, and in fact to bully. And we know there are some wonderful cases of this, that there was a disagreement with his brother, his own blood brother in the monastery, and Bernard excommunicated him, kicked him out of the monastery. And what happened then? Well, the interesting thing is that the monks ganged up on him and went on strike and forced him to admit that he'd been wrong and to take his brother back. Now, this is a very interesting story, because the only way that we know of this is through a letter which Bernard wrote describing, saying how grateful he was that the community rebelled against him and forced him to reconsider a hasty action. But then in many of the manuscripts, this part has been left out of the letter because it shows badly. Bernard was humble enough to say, well, I have a bit of a temper, I'm a bit of a boss, I'm a bit of a bully, and occasionally my community have to step in and save me from myself. But when they were trying for his canonization, well, they had to change all that. But it's a good incident that Bernard was a bully, and he knows that he was a bully, and he's trying to overcome it with the help of the rest of the community. But it took him 40 years or so of monastic life to make much progress. So through a lot of his life, he was a bully. In the case of the York election, in the case of Abelard, it was this basic business of, they were going to be heard before the council, and Bernard makes sure he arrives a day early and goes around and does his political thing, knowing that he couldn't compete with Abelard at the level of dialectic. But at the level of politics, Bernard was way ahead. And so the battle was eventually won before Abelard even arrived at the council. And when Abelard sent people off to Rome, they were a day or two behind Bernard's envoys. He even sent envoys off to make sure they got there first. Not a very nice man. Not a very nice sort of thing to do. But that was his tendency. Once he got onto a thing, he was inclined to bully. We think, when we say that he's a saint, that in the course of a lifetime he overcome this thing. But as we look at his writings, we can have to be aware of the fact that for many years he was still under bondage. He was enslaved by his own tendency to want to exercise power. And that was his particular nemesis, was the demon of power, domination, bulldozing people, bullying them. The darker side of his character was his tendency to ambition and to domination. Not his the uncertainties and hesitations projected onto him by his first biographer. On the contrary, Bernard was forthright and decisive, perhaps even impetuous. He had a strong and resourceful mental stance, he was tough-minded in other words, which was adept in seeing beyond immediate issues and capable of great deviousness if he thought the situation warranted it. You know, there are plenty of examples of that. Dealings with the general chapter, his dealings with bishops, and so forth. Great deviousness there. He was courageous in following his principles and unafraid of indifference or opposition. He was pig-headed, which, if you're a saint, becomes a virtue, but for the rest of us remains a vice. And so they say he was strong and forthright, but this is the character that you'd be electing if you elected him as abbot. Your only consolation, as the consolation of Clairvaux was, that he was never home. He spent a lot of his time away from the monastery. But he was he was able to charm people, but he was still a very, very strong individual. And this is where you need to think of people that you know. I keep coming back to this principle. To understand this personality, look at people that you know that are inclined to be charming and so forth. I can name a few of them. Can be very charming and forceful, and people like to follow them. They tend to gather around them people whom they can dominate and lead and go forward in a particular direction. And if you get to understand this, you'll try and understand that Bernard's a very complicated man. He's a full red-blooded man, but complicated. And to appreciate that he had to struggle against sin and struggle against his own faults and predominant passions and so forth, well, it helps us to locate his spiritual teaching in a more realistic frame of reference. So deft was he in dealing with difficult situations that occasionally he overreached himself and fell down, to the great applause of many, you can be sure. He was too sure of himself at times. That was probably good for him, since generally he was too sure of his own instinctive reactions and their intrinsic rightness. He had to learn that he wasn't always right. One of his problems, interestingly enough, was that he trusted people too much, and particularly people for whom he had high regard, like William of St. Thierry. Bernard wasn't much of a theologian, in inverted commas. William was. And so when William used to prime him by feeding him the latest gossip and get all Bernard stirred up about something, it was William who occasioned the Apologia, the diatribes against Cluniac monasticism. It was William who fed him the stuff about Abelard. Bernard never read him, but William said, Abelard. I can't say it now, I'll offend Kate. But William secretly was an old woman. Huh? He was, in that kind of context, that he fussed about things and he would feed and say, this is what Abelard is saying. And so Bernard would get terribly annoyed, wouldn't bother to read Abelard and go straight for the jugular, go straight to try and threaten him. The same with his thing on baptism, with the dualist heresy. Usually he was primed by somebody. Somebody would stir him up, would whisper in his ear, and he'd get so emotionally involved with something that he wouldn't stay to say, hang on, let's look and see if this is actually what Abelard does say. Let's see if this is the way that the black monks actually do live. And so somebody like William, who was a completely different personality, often served as the basic source of Bernard's drives. The curious thing about such a commanding personality is that although his strong views and manipulativeness gained him a few enemies, he made many more lifelong friends. It was for his charm, again, that he was mainly remembered by his contemporaries. Bernard was a pleasant man who treated persons of all ranks with an easy forthrightness and, on occasion, with great kindness and friendship. The simplest way of summarizing his personality is to say that he was a born leader and that for much of his life he was happiest and operated best when he had a devoted and enthusiastic following. If he'd spent too much time as a private and hadn't got his stripes, he probably would have been a disaster as a monk. He would have been mentioned in every visitation card as a troublemaker because he operated best when he was at top. But this brought its own temptations. Another thing that we need to bear in mind, if we are to understand him, is that in many of the controversies in which he was involved, Bernard sided with the sterner party. He always stood out for the strict observance, a fact which can give the impression that he was a harsh, unyielding, relentlessly opposed to any concessions to human frailty, and devoid of any appreciation of what might be called the liberal agenda. So that he was the one that wanted to sort of campaign on the motto, bring the old times back. You know, why can't we turn the clock back? That's the impression you can get, but that's a false impression. Certainly he was a conservative man. He perhaps never had a bright idea in his life, I don't think. He did have a few. The second coming, the second of the three Advents is one of his original ideas. And it seems that the theme of alternation, on which we'll be spending a lot of time, is also original. His use of language was original, but for the most part, his wasn't the charism of thinking new thoughts in the way that Abelard did and started a whole new method of theology, but rather of taking what was traditional and accepted and making it into something fresh and exciting. Certainly he was a conservative man with a zeal for discipline and reform and suspicious of frivolous innovation. He was not forever, however, dull or pompous. He had a great capacity for affection and much tenderness in dealing with those in trouble. Very compassionate man. Even on important occasions he could be light-hearted, as when his personal seal was stolen, he averred that the humorous tone of a letter would be sufficient to authenticate it. So in other words, he was known to be an amusing man, a humorous man, not a sad sack, but somebody, you know the way I write because it's got some jokes in it. That's what he's saying in effect, and you don't need a seal. Bernard was a complex personality. He was both charming and personable in the way that he dealt with others. I think there you should put other persons. It would be a bit clearer. When he was dealing with persons, he was charming, but he was uncompromising and even narrow in dealing with issues. That's an important thing for understanding him. Some people are just the opposite. You know, you ask them about anything, and they say, contraception, terrific, go right ahead. Abortion, go right ahead. Murder, that's all right, so long as you don't do it in the church on a Sunday. But actually in dealing with people, they're severe and harsh and rigid and so forth. On the other hand, I happen to know a canonist who is quite that way. You know, ask him about an issue and he will give you the broadest possible answer to it and all the possibilities, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But unfortunately, that's his normal gesture when he's talking. He makes that kind of thing as boxes, 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 boxes. But in dealing with people, straight down the line. How many times? So if you want a good answer from him, you ask him as an abstract issue question. But if you go with a personal problem, although I never have, but I hear, if you go with a personal problem, you get a very hard answer. Ask him about issues and he'll give you every possibility. He's the prince of laxists. And Bernard was just the opposite. Dealing with people, he was always kind and understanding and compassionate and open. But dealing with issues, and some of his writing tends to be more universal, he tends to be conservative and uncompromising and narrow. So that's the difference there. And it's a pardonable sin, I think. If he treats people well, you can excuse him for being a little bit narrow in what he writes. Both facets of his behaviour need to be taken into consideration if an accurate picture of his disposition is to be achieved. Particular point of interest is the extent to which Bernard seems to have grown during his rich and varied lifetime. Here, the assaying of evidence requires considerable sensitivity, which means it's very hard. You have to be very careful with your data. On the one hand, there is considerable evenness throughout his writings, both in content and in presentation. Notwithstanding the varying degrees of stylistic perfection achieved in the text, in proportion to the time and energy invested in polishing the text, Bernard's characteristic signature is discernible through a wide range of genre. It takes no great skill to decide that the Apologia, the Steps of Humility and Pride, are the works of a young man earning his spurs. They've got a lot of corners. They're angular kind of works. They're sharp. They're a bit nitty-picky, nitpicky. Whereas 5 books on consideration written for the Pope is a mellow, are clearly written in the mellow afterglow of an active life. It's a work of great experience. And you can see the same in the sermons on the Song of Songs, which seem to have been composed in blocks. So that the blocks that happened in the last few years of his life present a completely different picture to the ones that were composed when he was younger. In other words, he became mellower, he became softer, became sweeter, although his basic theological and anthropological insights remain more or less the same. Throughout his life, Bernard's writings are dominated by the same priorities. Whatever experience confirmed him in the insertion of whatever he experienced, whatever he experienced confirmed him in the assertion of the basic rightness of his views. Okay, but there is development, although this needs a fuller investigation. There is progressive fine-tuning of his views by which the grossness of some of his early generalizations is reduced. A greater delicacy supervenes. There is more emphasis on positive aspects, on the dynamics and pluriformity of individual journeys, and a consequent reduction in heavy-handed irony and nastiness. Bernard himself acknowledged that his views of the imagehood of human beings developed between the writing of the treatise on grace and free will and the sermons on the Song of Songs. Diversa sed not adversa. They are different, but not necessarily opposed. In other words, his views have developed somewhat in the 30 years or so between writing the last sections of the Song of Songs and the treatise on grace and free choice. Jean Leclerc attributes this to a progressive purification through which Bernard became more Bernard, his inner distortions and inconsistency progressing yielding to the grace of God and the labour of decades. And it's interesting also that on a more literary level is that as time went by, Bernard expresses a preference for the sermon genre over the Tractatus or the treatise. Now, a treatise is an abstract, fairly universal kind of statement. Although it has a dedicatory letter, it's meant to be a a fairly formal treatment of a particular issue in some logical sequence. Whereas sermons, as we all know, are rather freer form constructions. And so as time went by, Bernard wrote more and more sermons and less treatises. In fact, when he came to do what everybody wanted to do in the 12th century, write his own commentary on the Song of Songs, he chose to do it in the sermon genre, which meant that it's not a commentary in fact. It's sermones super cantica canticorum, or reflections on a theme, sermons on a theme. And it's a very loose and open thing, which he progressively modified to suit his purpose. Sometimes he just takes a starting point from the text and then meanders around, so that the distractions and the deviations are just as important in a sermon as the actual relationship of what he writes to the text itself. But that's an interesting thing. The sermon is a much more human communication. A treatise is something that's written for the library, it's put in there, it's the librarian's job to come in and dust it, because nobody reads it. Whereas a sermon is meant to be delivered, it's meant to be heard, even if it's a literary sermon. As most of Bernard's were. They weren't dictated, but they were written, very carefully written, but in the form of a sermon. In other words, when we read them, we have to experience them as a person talking to a person. It's a personal interchange. It's not just simply a treatise. This is the last word on certain particular issues, but let's talk about this. Let me tell you how I think about this kind of thing. To understand more of the personality of Bernard, it's necessary to appreciate him as a writer, so as to gain from a reading of his works an accurate profile of their author. Hence, we must now pass to this aspect of his career. Not now, but later.